In the small city of Augusta, Georgia, in the summer of 2023, Janiya received the devastating news that shattered her world. Her husband, Reggie, had perished in a car accident on a lonely stretch of highway while driving home from a grueling night shift at the factory. Janiya, a 30-year-old nurse who had always carried herself with quiet resilience, found her strength crumbling under the weight of this loss. The call from the police came late in the evening, delivered with clinical detachment, leaving her standing frozen in the living room of their modest two-bedroom home. The officer's words echoed in her mind, but they felt distant, unreal, as if they described someone else's tragedy. She sank onto the warm couch, staring at the framed photograph on the coffee table, a snapshot from their wedding 3 years earlier, where Reggie's wide grin had lit up the frame, his arms slung around her shoulders. The memory of that day, filled with laughter and promises, now felt like a cruel mirage. Janiya's days blurred into a haze of grief. She stopped going to work, letting her shifts at the hospital pile up as unanswered voicemails from her supervisor accumulated. The house, once a haven of shared dreams, became a museum of Reggie's absence. She wandered through it aimlessly, her fingers tracing the edges of his belongings. His favourite leather jacket still hung on the back of a kitchen chair, its faint scent of motor oil and cologne lingering like a ghost. She couldn't bring herself to move it. Old love letters tucked away in a shoebox under their bed became her nightly ritual. She read them under the dim glow of a bedside lamp, her tears staining the creased pages where Reggie's messy handwriting declared his devotion. The outside world felt intrusive, suffocating. Friends dropped by with casseroles and murmured condolences, their well-meaning gestures only deepening Janiya's isolation. She nodded politely, her eyes vacant, and closed the door as soon as they left. Colleagues from the hospital sent texts offering to cover her shifts or bring her coffee, but she ignored them, unable to bear their pity. The thought of returning to the bustling emergency room, where she had once thrived under pressure, now seemed impossible. Every corner of Augusta held memories of Reggie, the diner where they'd shared late-night fries, the park where they'd walked hand in hand, the factory's looming silhouette visible from their backyard. The city itself felt like a cage, trapping her in a past she could no longer touch. Janiya's body began to betray her as well. She noticed a persistent exhaustion that no amount of sleep could ease. Her head throbbed with dizzy spells, and her appetite vanished, leaving her to pick at meals she couldn't finish. She attributed it all to the toll of her grief, dismissing the symptoms as the natural consequence of a broken heart. Mornings were spent staring out the kitchen window, watching neighbours go about their routines, their normalcy a stark contrast to her unravelling world. She avoided mirrors, unwilling to face the hollowed-out version of herself, her once vibrant eyes now dulled, her skin sallow from sleepless nights. The plans she and Reggie had built together haunted her. They had talked about starting a family, saving for a bigger house, maybe even taking a trip to the coast. Those dreams now lay in ruins, as unreachable as Reggie himself. Janiya clung to small rituals to keep his memory alive. She played his favourite jazz records on the old turntable, letting the soulful notes fill the silence. She kept his side of the bed untouched, the pillow still indented from his head. At night, she lay awake, replaying their last morning together, Reggie kissing her forehead before leaving for work, promising to be home for dinner. The guilt of not holding him longer, not saying more, gnawed at her. Weeks passed, and Janiya's world shrank to the confines of their home. She stopped answering the phone, letting it ring until the silence returned. The mailbox overflowed with unopened bills and condolence cards. She felt adrift, unmoored, as if the life she had known had been erased in a single moment. The accident report, delivered to her doorstep, sat unopened on the kitchen counter. She couldn't bring herself to read the details of Reggie's final moments, afraid they would make his absence even more real. Yet, amidst the despair, a small part of her clung to the fragments of their life together, searching for a reason to keep going, even as hope seemed impossibly distant. 2 months after Reggie's death, Janiya began to notice subtle changes in her body. Mornings brought waves of nausea that forced her to linger near the bathroom sink, clutching the counter as the room spun. Scents that once comforted her, the coffee brewing in the kitchen, The lavender soap in the shower now turned her stomach. When she realized her period was late, a flicker of suspicion stirred beneath her grief. She hesitated, almost afraid to confront the possibility, but eventually drove to a pharmacy on the outskirts of Augusta. Standing in the aisle, surrounded by fluorescent lights and rows of boxes, she selected a pregnancy test, her hands trembling as she tucked it into her basket. Back home, she sat on the edge of the bathtub, staring at the small plastic stick as two faint lines appeared. The confirmation hit her like a tidal wave, a mixture of disbelief and fragile hope washing over her. The news was overwhelming, yet it sparked something Janiya hadn't felt since Reggie's accident, a reason to keep moving forward. She saw the pregnancy as a final gift from him, a piece of their love that had survived the tragedy. The thought of carrying Reggie's child gave her a sense of purpose, pulling her out of the fog that had clouded her days. She began to take tentative steps toward caring for herself. She forced herself to eat, preparing simple meals like oatmeal or fruit smoothies, even when her appetite resisted. She scheduled an appointment with an obstetrician, sitting nervously in the waiting room, surrounded by expectant mothers whose chatter felt foreign but strangely comforting. The doctor's confirmation of her pregnancy, along with a grainy ultrasound image of a tiny heartbeat, made the reality tangible. Janiya clutched the printout as she drove home, her fingers tracing the blurry shape that tethered her to Reggie. Determined to embrace this new chapter, Janiya enrolled in a prenatal class at a community centre in Augusta. The classes were held in a brightly lit room with posters of smiling babies on the walls. And though she initially felt out of place among the other women, their shared experience began to chip away at her isolation. She listened intently as the instructor explained breathing techniques and nutrition plans, taking careful notes in a small spiral notebook. At home, she cleared a corner of the bedroom, envisioning a space for the baby. She dragged an old wooden rocking chair from the attic, dusting it off and imagining late nights rocking her child to sleep. She ordered a crib online, choosing a simple white one that matched the soft blue curtains she and Reggie had hung together. The act of assembling the nursery, however small, felt like a quiet rebellion against her grief. Janiya also turned to books, filling her nights with reading about pregnancy and parenting. She stacked guides on her nightstand, their pages dog-eared with notes about prenatal vitamins and developmental milestones. She found solace in imagining the child she would raise, picturing a boy with Reggie's warm brown eyes or a girl with his infectious laugh. These visions anchored her, giving her something to hold on to when memories of Reggie threatened to pull her under. She began to talk to the baby, her voice soft as she rested her hand on her still flat stomach, whispering promises of love and protection. The thought that this child might inherit Reggie's kindness or his stubborn determination filled her with a bittersweet pride. For the first time since the accident, Janiya reached out to others. She called her mother, who lived an hour away in Macon, and shared the news. Her mother's voice, warm and steady, brought tears to Janiya's eyes as she promised to visit soon with homemade peach cobbler and baby clothes. Janiya also confided in her closest friend Latoya, a fellow nurse who had been checking on her relentlessly. Latoya came over with a bag of herbal teas and a playlist of upbeat music, insisting they celebrate the new life Janiya was carrying. They sat on the couch, sipping tea and flipping through baby name books, laughing for the first time in months as they debated between classic names and ones with a modern flair. These moments, though fleeting, reminded Janiya of the woman she'd been before the accident, someone who found joy in small things, who believed in brighter days. The house, once a shrine to her loss, began to feel alive again. Janiya opened the windows, letting fresh air sweep through the rooms. She played Reggie's jazz records, less out of sorrow and more as a way to share him with the baby. She hung a small ultrasound photo next to their wedding picture, a quiet promise that this child would know their father's love, even if only through her stories. Her health, though still fragile, began to stabilize as she followed the doctor's advice, taking daily walks around the neighborhood to clear her mind. The streets of Augusta, once suffocating with memories, now felt like a place where she could rebuild. Each step, each choice to care for herself and the baby was a thread stitching her back together, weaving hope into the fabric of her grief. Janiya's pregnancy unfolded with challenges that tested her newfound resolve. High blood pressure plagued her, forcing frequent visits to the obstetrician's office in Augusta, where she sat through countless blood pressure checks and stern warnings to rest. Constant fatigue weighed her down, making even simple tasks like climbing the stairs to her bedroom feel monumental. Yet, her determination to nurture the life growing inside her kept her going. She clung to the image of the baby as a piece of Reggie, a living connection to the love they had shared. She chose the name Elijah, after Reggie's grandfather, a man whose stories of resilience had always inspired her husband. The name felt like a bridge to the past, a way to honor Reggie's roots while building a future for their child. Janiya whispered the name to herself during quiet moments, her hands resting on her growing belly, imagining a boy who might carry Reggie's gentle spirit. As the months passed, Janiya adapted to the rhythms of pregnancy. She followed her doctor's orders meticulously, swallowing prenatal vitamins and forcing herself to eat nutrient-rich meals despite her lack of appetite. She attended every prenatal class, absorbing advice on childbirth and newborn care, her notebook filled with tips on swaddling and soothing techniques. The nursery corner in her bedroom took shape, now complete with a crib, a stack of soft blankets, and a mobile of tiny stars that spun gently above. She painted the walls a soft yellow, a colour she and Reggie had once picked out for a dream home they never bought. Each small act of preparation felt like a promise to Elijah, a vow that she would be the mother he deserved, no matter how heavy her heart felt. When the time for delivery arrived, Janiya faced it with a mix of anticipation and fear. The labour was grueling, stretching over 18 hours in a sterile hospital room at Augusta University Medical Center. Pain coursed through her, relentless and overwhelming, but she focused on the thought of meeting her child. The hospital staff moved efficiently around her, their presence a blur as she gripped the bed rails, breathing through each contraction. When Elijah finally arrived, his first cry pierced the air, a sound that brought tears to Janiya's eyes. The nurses placed him in her arms, his tiny body warm and fragile, his dark eyes blinking up at her. She studied his face, searching for traces of Reggie, his nose, his jawline, but found only the newness of a life just beginning. The exhaustion of labour faded as she held him, replaced by a fierce, protective love that anchored her in the moment. In the days that followed, Janiya immersed herself in motherhood. She stayed in the hospital for 3 days, learning to feed and change Elijah under the guidance of patient nurses. His first smiles, tentative and fleeting, filled her with a joy she hadn't thought possible since Reggie's death. She marvelled at his tiny fingers curling around hers, the soft coos he made in his sleep. Back home, she settled into a routine, waking every few hours to tend to his needs. The rocking chair in the nursery became her refuge, where she spent hours cradling Elijah, humming lullabies she remembered from her own childhood. The house, once silent with grief, now echoed with the soft sounds of a newborn, his gurgles, his cries, the creak of the chair as she rocked him to sleep. Yet amidst the joy, a subtle unease lingered. The hospital had insisted on a genetic test for Elijah, citing minor irregularities in his initial health screenings that warranted further investigation. Janiya had signed the consent forms without much thought, her mind consumed by the demands of caring for a newborn. The nurses had assured her it was routine, a precaution to ensure Elijah's long-term health, and she trusted their expertise. Still, as she sat in the rocking chair late at night, Elijah asleep against her chest, fragments of memory from the day of the accident surfaced unbidden. She had been in the hospital herself, dazed and disoriented from a concussion sustained in the same crash that killed Reggie. The details were hazy, flashes of a sterile room, the hum of medical equipment, the presence of a young male orderly who lingered in her doorway. She pushed the thoughts away, unwilling to let them taint the purity of her bond with Elijah, but they left a faint shadow in her mind. Janiya focused on the present, determined to be the best mother she could be. She snapped photos of Elijah's milestones, his first bath, his first time grasping a rattle, and sent them to her mother and Latoya, who responded with excited messages. She ventured out for short walks, pushing Elijah's stroller through the neighborhood, the spring air warm against her skin. Passers-by stopped to coo at the baby, and though Janiya still shied away from small talk, their kindness softened her edges. She began to imagine a future where Elijah would grow up knowing about his father, surrounded by stories of Reggie's laughter and love. Yet the memory of that hospital stay, brief and blurry as it was, remained a quiet undercurrent, a question she wasn't ready to face. A month after Elijah's birth, Janiya received a call from the hospital that unraveled the fragile world she had begun to rebuild. The genetic test results for her son had arrived, and a nurse's clipped voice requested her presence to discuss them. Janiya arrived at Augusta University Medical Center, Elijah asleep in his car seat beside her, expecting routine clarification about his health. Instead, the doctor sat her down in a small, sterile office and delivered news that felt like a physical blow. Elijah was not biologically related to Reggie. The words hung heavy in the air, incomprehensible at first. Janiya's hands tightened around the straps of Elijah's carrier, her mind rejecting the information. She demanded a retest, her voice trembling with disbelief, insisting there had to be a mistake. The doctor, sympathetic but firm, explained that the results were conclusive, confirmed by a second analysis. Janiya left the office in a daze, the weight of the truth pressing against her chest as she drove home, Elijah's soft breathing the only sound in the car. Back in her quiet house, Janiya sat on the couch, staring at the ultrasound photo she had taped beside Reggie's wedding picture. The joy she had felt in those early weeks of motherhood now felt tainted, overshadowed by a growing sense of betrayal. She tried to reconcile the doctor's words with her reality, but the pieces refused to fit. Elijah, with his tiny hands and curious eyes, was her son, her connection to Reggie, or so she had believed. The realization that he wasn't Reggie's child tore at her, reopening the wound of her husband's death. She paced the living room, her thoughts spiraling as she grappled with the implications. How could this have happened? The question gnawed at her, pulling her back to the day of the accident that had taken Reggie and left her broken. Her memory of that day was fragmented, blurred by the concussion she had sustained in the crash. She had been admitted to the same hospital where she now worked, her mind clouded by pain and medication. Images flickered in her mind like a poorly edited film, the sterile white walls of her hospital room, the steady beep of a monitor, the sensation of being alone yet not alone. She recalled a young orderly, his face indistinct but his presence lingering longer than necessary. He had adjusted her IV, checked her chart and stayed by her bedside, his movements slow and deliberate. At the time, she had been too disoriented to question it, her consciousness slipping in and out. Now, those moments took on a sinister clarity. The realization hit her with sickening force. Someone had taken advantage of her vulnerability, exploiting her unconscious state in the aftermath of the accident. Janiya's stomach churned as the truth settled in. She sat by Elijah's crib, watching him sleep, his chest rising and falling with innocent rhythm. She loved him fiercely, unconditionally, but the knowledge of how he came to be filled her with a visceral horror. She felt violated, her body no longer her own, her trust in the world shattered. The hospital, a place where she had spent years caring for others, now felt like a site of betrayal. She wondered how she could have missed the signs, how she could have been so unaware in those critical hours. Guilt mingled with her anger, as if she had failed to protect herself, failed to preserve the sanctity of her bond with Reggie. The days that followed were a blur of sleepless nights and restless thoughts. Janiya avoided looking at the hospital paperwork, unable to face the clinical language that confirmed her worst fears. She stopped answering calls from Latoya and her mother, unable to articulate the storm raging inside her. She sat for hours in the rocking chair, Elijah in her arms, torn between her love for him and the pain of his origins. She studied his face, searching for Reggie, but found only questions. Was there a trace of the orderly in his features? The thought made her skin crawl. Yet she couldn't bring herself to resent Elijah. He was blameless, a child who needed her as much as she needed him. This conflict tore at her, leaving her feeling like she was betraying both Reggie and herself. Janiya's faith in the goodness of the world, already fragile after Reggie's death, crumbled further. She had always believed in the compassion of her profession, in the sanctity of the hospital as a place of healing. Now that belief lay in ruins. She avoided her shifts at work, unable to step into the same halls where her violation had occurred. The thought of the orderly, a faceless figure in her memory, consumed her. She tried to piece together his appearance, his height, the sound of his voice, but the details remained elusive, buried in the fog of that day. Her anger grew, a quiet fire that burned alongside her love for Elijah, fueling a determination to understand what had happened, even as she dreaded the answers. Janiya's resolve hardened as the shock of the genetic test results gave way to a burning need for answers. She could no longer sit in the silence of her home, haunted by fragmented memories of that day in the hospital. Determined to uncover the truth, she began her search at Augusta University Medical Center, where the violation had occurred. With baby Elijah strapped to her chest in a carrier, she walked into the hospital's administrative office and demanded the list of staff who had been on duty the day of her hospitalization after the accident. The clerk, polite but wary, cited privacy policies and bureaucratic obstacles, vaguely promising to look into it. Janiya's frustration grew, her voice steady but growing sharper, refusing to be brushed off. She left empty-handed, but her determination only deepened, fueled by the betrayal that had stained every memory of that day. Undeterred, Janiya took the matter into her own hands. She spent hours going through the medical documents she had kept, looking for any clue about the orderly who had lingered in her room. A misplaced shift schedule tucked in with her discharge papers listed a name. Caleb, a male orderly who had worked the evening she was admitted. The name resonated, stirring a vague image of a young man with a calm demeanor and measured movements. When she called the hospital to ask about him, she learned he had resigned shortly after that day and had left Augusta. The abruptness of his departure raised red flags, and she decided to dig deeper, refusing to let the truth slip away. Janiya hired a private investigator named Marcus, an older man working out of a cramped office in downtown Augusta, faintly smelling of cigarettes. She met with him, handed over every detail she could recall. Marcus listened intently, taking notes as she described the orderly and the timeline of her hospital stay. He promised to find Caleb, warning that it might take time. Janiya dipped into her savings to pay his fees, a price she was willing to pay for the answers she needed. While waiting for updates, she tried to juggle motherhood with the emotional weight of the search. Taking care of Elijah, feeding, bathing, the quiet moments of sleep kept her grounded, but her mind was consumed by the pursuit of justice. Weeks later, Marcus called. He had found Caleb. He was now working as an orderly at a clinic in Columbia, South Carolina, just a few hours from Augusta. The investigator had discovered Caleb left Augusta citing personal reasons and had no prior disciplinary record. Marcus provided a photo, a young man with sharp features and a charming smile. The image matched the fleeting memories in Janiya's mind, confirming her suspicions. Overcome with anger and resolve, she decided to confront him. She asked her mother to watch Elijah, got behind the wheel and drove to Columbia, gripping the steering wheel as she rehearsed what she would say. At the clinic, Janiya found Caleb in the break room, his name tag pinned to light blue scrubs. He was standing near a vending machine, laughing with a co-worker, his ease in stark contrast to the storm inside her. When she approached, his smile faded, unease flashing across his face. Janiya introduced herself, her voice calm but cold, and asked to speak in private. In a quiet hallway of the clinic, she confronted him about that day. Caleb initially denied everything, speaking evenly and claiming not to remember her, but his eyes darted nervously, and his hands fidgeted at the hem of his scrubs. Janiya pressed harder, describing the moments she remembered, watching as his composure began to break, his shoulders sagging under the weight of her words. Back in Augusta, Janiya channeled her rage into action. She returned to Marcus, who had obtained grainy security footage from the hospital, showing Caleb entering and exiting her room multiple times. The timestamps aligned with her memory, offering enough proof to start a case. Janiya met with a police detective, a serious woman who listened carefully as Janiya told her story. The detective took the footage and Marcus's report, promising to investigate. Janiya filed an official complaint accusing Caleb of rape, her hands trembling as she signed the documents. The act felt like reclaiming her power, but also deepened her internal conflict. Every night, as she rocked Elijah to sleep, she struggled with the paradox of her love for him and the pain of how he came to be. She couldn't hate her son. His innocent gaze reminded her of her strength. And yet, the truth remained a wound that would not heal. The courtroom in Augusta became a crucible for Janiya, each session a painful excavation of her trauma. She sat in the witness box, her hands folded tightly in her lap, as lawyers dissected the events of that fateful day in the hospital. The sterile fluorescent lights and the murmur of spectators amplified her sense of exposure, as if her pain were on display for strangers to judge. Caleb sat across the room, his head bowed, no longer the confident orderly she had confronted in Colombia. When called to testify, he admitted his guilt, his voice low but steady, confessing to taking advantage of Janiya's unconscious state. But he also shared a story of his own, a life marked by loneliness, a recent divorce, and a spiral of self-loathing that had led to his unforgivable act. He expressed remorse not as a defense, but as a plea for understanding, his eyes meeting Janiya's briefly before dropping to the floor. His sincerity stirred something in her, a flicker of doubt amidst her anger, though she pushed it aside, focusing on the justice she sought. The trial wore on, each day draining Janiya further. She faced relentless questions from the defense, probing her memory and her actions, as if her trauma could be quantified or dismissed. Reporters lingered outside the courthouse, their cameras flashing as she shielded her face, their stories painting her as both victim and enigma. The weight of public scrutiny pressed on her, but she returned to Elijah each night, finding solace in his innocent presence. His laughter, his tiny hands reaching for her, reminded her why she had pursued this fight. Yet, as the trial neared its climax, Janiya's resolve wavered. On the day she was to deliver her final testimony, she froze in the witness stand, her throat tightening as she looked at Caleb. Instead of recounting her pain, she shook her head, refusing to speak, her silence stunning the courtroom. Her lawyer, visibly shaken, pressed her to reconsider, but Janiya left the stand, her decision final, leaving the prosecution scrambling to salvage their case. After the trial, which ended with Caleb receiving a suspended sentence due to Janiya's refusal to testify, she sought him out. She found him at a coffee shop near the courthouse, his face etched with exhaustion and guilt. Their first meeting was tense, Janiya's anger still raw, but Caleb's quiet acknowledgement of his wrongdoings disarmed her. He offered no excuses, only a commitment to make amends. Against her better judgment, Janiya agreed to meet again, driven by a need to understand the man who had changed her life so irrevocably. Their encounters were halting at first, marked by long silences and guarded glances. Caleb began to visit her home, offering help with small tasks, fixing a leaky faucet, carrying groceries, always respectful, always keeping his distance. When he met Elijah, his eyes softened and he asked permission to hold him, his hands trembling as he cradled the boy. Over weeks, then months, Caleb's presence became a strange constant in Janiya's life. He attended parenting classes, learning to change diapers and prepare bottles, his efforts a quiet apology for the past. Janiya watched him with Elijah, noting the genuine care in his actions, the way he sang softly to calm the baby's cries, the patience he showed during late-night feedings. Her heart, once hardened against him, began to soften, though she wrestled with the contradiction. How could she feel anything but hatred for the man who had violated her? Yet his dedication to Elijah, his willingness to face his shame, challenged her assumptions. She began to see him not as a monster, but as a flawed human seeking redemption, a mirror to her own struggle to move beyond her pain. A year after the trial, Janiya made a choice that surprised even herself. She and Caleb married in a quiet ceremony at a small chapel in Augusta, attended only by her mother, Latoya, and a handful of trusted friends. The decision was not born of romance, but of a shared commitment to Elijah, a recognition that their lives were now intertwined through him. Janiya wore a simple white dress, her hands steady as she exchanged vows, promising not love but partnership and healing. They moved into a new home, a modest rental on the edge of town, where they built a life centered on their son. Janiya returned to nursing, her shifts a reminder of her strength, while Caleb worked at a local community centre, dedicating himself to helping others. Elijah grew, his laughter filling their home, a testament to Janiya's capacity for forgiveness. She learned to let go of the past, not erasing it, but transforming it into a foundation for a family where love, however complicated, prevailed.